It began as a hobby. After a long day at work, Ethan liked to unwind by taking nighttime photos of the city. There was something soothing about wandering the streets when everything was quiet, the hum of distant traffic blending into the background. He captured the stillness, the glow of streetlights, the shimmer of reflections in puddles, the way fog wrapped itself around empty benches. One night, after reviewing a batch of shots he had taken in a park near his apartment, Ethan noticed something strange. In the background of one photo, standing beneath a dim street lamp, was a figure, just barely visible in the shadows. At first he thought nothing of it. People walked through parks at night all the time. But the more he looked, the more wrong it seemed. The figure had no face. There were no distinct features at all. It was just a vague, dark shape, a person-shaped silhouette, fuzzy around the edges, as if it were made of static. And the more he stared, the more unnerving it became. He could have sworn it wasn't there when he took the photo. The park had been empty. Shaking it off as a trick of the light, Ethan moved on to the next photo. But the figure was there again. Closer this time, standing between two trees, a faceless shadow in the distance. His skin prickled with unease. Had someone been following him? That night he barely slept, his mind replaying the image of the faceless figure over and over. The next morning, he checked the photos again, hoping it had been some glitch. But the figure was still there. More than one, actually. Now, looking closely, he realized that in several of the photos, there were multiple shadowy figures, hidden in the background. They were always in the darkest parts of the frame, blending into the shadows like they didn't want to be seen. But there was something more unsettling. Each time he scrolled through the photos, the figures seemed to shift, as if they were subtly moving, inching closer, even though the images were supposed to be frozen in time. It was impossible. And yet, the figures were never in the same spot twice. Determined to prove it was all in his head, Ethan went out again that night, camera in hand. He roamed the same park, taking photos of the same locations, trees, benches, the empty pathway under the street lamp. Everything felt normal, calm. When he got home, he plugged his camera into his laptop and began uploading the new photos. As they appeared on the screen, his heart sank. The figures were there again. More of them this time. Dozens of faceless, static-filled shapes, scattered across the images like some kind of nightmare parade. They were closer now, almost close enough to touch. Ethan's hands shook as he zoomed in on one of the figures. It was no more than a shadow, but in its featureless face, he felt an overwhelming sense of watching, like it was aware of him. They all were. He slammed his laptop shut, refusing to look any longer. But that night, sleep was impossible. Every sound outside his window made him jump. Every creak of the floorboards set his heart racing. The photos felt like a bad dream, but he knew they weren't. The next morning, his phone buzzed with a text from his friend Rachel, a fellow photographer. "Hey, your photos are freaking me out. You trying out some new editing trick?" Confused, Ethan called her. "What do you mean?" Rachel hesitated on the other end of the line. "The ones you posted last night, they're different. They weren't like that before." Ethan's blood ran cold. "Posted? I didn't post anything." "Yeah, you did," Rachel insisted. "It's all over your feed." His stomach lurched as he opened his social media. There they were, his photos, all of them, posted during the night while he slept. The captions were ones he had never written. "They're watching. Don't look too closely. You can't hide." Panic set in. Ethan deleted the posts immediately, but the damage was done. More people began messaging him, asking what the figures in his photos were. Some joked, others expressed concern, but one message stood out from the rest. It was from an account with no profile picture, no username. The message was simple. You shouldn't have seen them. Ethan felt a knot form in his stomach. He tried to ignore it, but the sense of being watched grew stronger. The air around him felt thick, suffocating. He closed all the blinds, locking every window and door, but it didn't help. Later that night, as he sat in his apartment trying to distract himself with TV, he heard a noise. It was subtle at first, like static coming from an old, broken radio. But it wasn't coming from his TV. It was coming from the hallway just outside his door. His chest tightened. Slowly, he stood and walked toward the door. The sound grew louder, more defined, like faint whispers, broken up by bursts of static. He peered through the peephole and his breath caught in his throat. Standing in the hallway were three of the figures. Faceless, motionless, their bodies slightly flickering like static on an old television. They were just as he had seen them in the photos, but now they were real. Right outside his door. Ethan stumbled back, panic overtaking him. He grabbed his phone and frantically tried to call someone, anyone, but the screen was frozen. The static from the hallway crept into the room, as though it was seeping through the very walls. A soft knock echoed from the door. Ethan's mind raced. He knew he couldn't open it. He couldn't let them in. But even as he backed away, something in his brain whispered that it was already too late. They had seen him. They had always seen him. Another knock, louder this time. The figures outside flickered in and out of existence, each moment bringing them closer to the door. And then, just as the sound reached its peak, it stopped. Silence. Ethan hesitated, fear coursing through his veins. Slowly, he approached the door again, peering once more through the peephole. The hallway was empty. He let out a shaky breath, but it was cut short as his phone buzzed on the table behind him. A new message. It was from the same anonymous account. "Look behind you." The static began again. Ethan turned, but there was no one in the room, only shadows, and they were moving. Hannah had been attending Crestwood High for 3 years, but the place still felt like a labyrinth to her. With its old brick walls, creaky floors, and constant renovations, it was easy to get turned around. That's why, when she first saw the corridor, she didn't think much of it. It was a Tuesday afternoon, and Hannah had stayed late to work on a group project. When she finished, the school was eerily empty, the hallways dark and quiet. She took a wrong turn on her way to the exit and found herself at the far end of the East Wing, a part of the building she rarely visited. As she walked past the art classrooms, she noticed something strange. There was a hallway she had never seen before, narrow and dimly lit, tucked between 2 lockers. It didn't look like it belonged there at all. The walls were older, the paint peeling, and the floor was scuffed and uneven. But it didn't feel new or renovated. It felt ancient, like it had always been there, waiting to be found. Curiosity got the better of her. She stepped into the hallway, her footsteps echoing faintly as she moved deeper. The air grew cooler, and the fluorescent lights overhead flickered weakly, casting long shadows on the floor. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched, but there was no one around. Hannah pulled out her phone to check the time, but the screen was frozen, the signal dead. She frowned and slipped it back into her pocket. The hallway stretched on much farther than it should have. By now she should have hit the back wall of the school, but it just kept going. Then, she saw the first door. It was an old wooden classroom door with a frosted glass window, the kind that hadn't been used in Crestwood for decades. A brass plaque next to it read, "Room 103, in a faded script. Hannah hesitated, her hand hovering over the doorknob, before giving in to her growing curiosity. She twisted it and pushed the door open. Inside was a classroom, but it was nothing like any room in Crestwood High. The desks were wooden and bolted to the floor, their surfaces scratched and worn. An old chalkboard covered one wall, and the air smelled of chalk dust and mildew. Everything felt off. There were no computers, no projectors, nothing modern at all. But what unsettled her most were the students. They were sitting perfectly still at their desks, dressed in old-fashioned clothes, like something out of the 1950s. The boys wore suspenders and button-up shirts, while the girls had poodle skirts and curled hair. They were silent, not speaking or moving, all of them staring straight ahead at the empty teacher's desk. Hannah's heart raced. She stepped backward, trying to leave as quietly as she could, but the moment she moved, the entire class turned to look at her in unison, their eyes cold and empty. She slammed the door shut and ran back down the hallway, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She didn't stop until she was sure she had put enough distance between herself and whatever that was. But as she caught her breath and looked around, she realized something horrifying. The hallway hadn't ended. She should have been back in the familiar part of the school by now, but instead, she was faced with another stretch of corridor, just as long and dark as before, and there were more doors. The first one she passed looked more modern, like a typical Crestwood classroom, but the further she went, the more the doors began to change. They became stranger, more out of place. Some were made of iron, others had no handles, only strange symbols etched into the wood. One was locked tight with thick chains. Hannah tried turning around, but the hallway behind her had changed. It wasn't the one she had come from. The walls were darker, the light dimmer, and the doors, they were everywhere now, lining both sides of the endless corridor. Desperate, she opened another door, hoping it would lead back to something familiar. But what she found inside chilled her to the bone. The classroom looked like it belonged to another era entirely. The walls were covered in strange symbols, and the desks were arranged in a circular pattern, surrounding a massive ancient book that lay open on a stone pedestal in the center of the room. The air was heavy with the scent of old parchment and something else, something metallic, like blood. There were no students in this room, only the faint sound of whispering, though she couldn't tell where it was coming from. The whispers were soft at first, unintelligible, but as she strained to listen, they grew louder, more distinct. She's here. She doesn't belong. She mustn't leave. Hannah backed out of the room, her heart hammering in her chest. She slammed the door shut and sprinted down the corridor, not caring where she was going, only that she had to get out. But no matter how far she ran, the corridor never ended. It just stretched on, with more doors, each one leading to a classroom stranger than the last. Some seemed normal at first glance, but the more she looked, the more she noticed small, unsettling details. A clock with numbers that moved backward, windows that looked out onto an endless void, or desks that had too many chairs, each one occupied by shadowy, faceless figures. Then, in the distance, she saw a light. A bright, flickering light, like an exit sign at the far end of the hallway. Her heart surged with hope, and she ran faster, ignoring the eerie classrooms and the oppressive silence that weighed on her. As she neared the light, she realized it was an open door, spilling warm, familiar light into the corridor. She burst through it, desperate to escape whatever nightmare she had stumbled into. But instead of finding the familiar school lobby, she was standing in another classroom. This one was different. The air was thick with humidity, and the walls were covered in moss and vines, as though the room had been abandoned for centuries. The desks were broken, half sunken into the ground. The windows looked out onto a jungle, wild and overgrown, and sitting at one of the broken desks was herself. Hannah froze, staring at the figure slumped in the chair. It was her, down to the last detail. Same clothes, same messy ponytail, same terrified expression. But her other self didn't move. She just sat there, eyes wide and unblinking, as though she had been trapped there for years, forgotten. Before she could process what she was seeing, the door slammed shut behind her, the sound echoing through the room like a final judgment. She ran to the door and tried to wrench it open, but it wouldn't budge. She was trapped. And then she felt it. A presence. Something watching her from the shadows of the room. Slowly she turned, and from the darkest corner of the room, a figure emerged. It was tall and featureless, its body flickering like a broken projection, but its eyes, or where its eyes should have been, were locked on her. The whispers returned, louder now, filling her head with their eerie chant. You don't belong. You never did. Welcome to the corridor. The figure stepped closer, its presence oppressive, its form flickering in and out of focus like static. Hannah backed away, her mind racing for an escape, but deep down, she knew there was none. She was part of the corridor now, and no one would remember she had ever been there. It was a cold, rainy night when Clara first met the Dream Trader. She had been walking home from her late shift at the diner, tired and lost in her own thoughts, when she noticed the man sitting at a small wooden table beneath a flickering street lamp. His booth seemed out of place, like something out of an old carnival. A black velvet tablecloth, a stack of faded cards, and a single lantern casting a soft, eerie glow. A crooked sign hung above him, barely readable in the dim light. Dreams for trade. Name your wish. Curiosity stopped Clara in her tracks. She was no stranger to desperation. Her life had been a string of disappointments, failed dreams, and endless struggles. If anyone needed a miracle, it was her. But there was something about the man that made her uneasy. He was too still, his face too shadowed beneath the brim of his wide hat, the details of his features just out of reach. As if sensing her hesitation, the man spoke in a low, smooth voice. You look like someone who's carrying a burden. His lips curled into a smile, but it never reached his eyes. I can help with that. Clara blinked. Help how? He gestured to the chair across from him. I make dreams come true. Your deepest wish, your greatest desire, whatever you want. All I ask for is a memory in return. Just one. She hesitated, but found herself taking a seat. What kind of memory? A precious one, he replied, folding his hands on the table. Something you hold dear. A moment, a feeling, a part of who you are. But don't worry, you won't miss it. What I give you will make up for it tenfold. It sounded too good to be true, and Clara knew better than to trust strangers. But something about the man, his calm certainty, the magnetic pull of his offer, made her want to believe. She thought of her crumbling apartment, the bills she couldn't pay, the dreams she'd given up on years ago. What was one memory, really, compared to the life she could have? What's the catch? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. No catch, the Dream Trader said smoothly. Just an exchange. A dream for a memory. Clara's mind raced. A part of her screamed to walk away, but the temptation was overwhelming. What if it really worked? What if she could finally have what she'd always wanted? I want to be a successful artist, she blurted out, her heart pounding. That's my dream. The Dream Trader nodded, as if he had expected this. And what memory will you give me in return? Clara thought for a moment. What could she trade? She sifted through her mind, trying to find something she could part with. Something important, but not irreplaceable. I'll give you the memory of my first painting, she said, a small pang of guilt stabbing at her chest. It had been a special moment, that first time she had picked up a brush and created something entirely her own. But she hadn't painted in years. Her dream of being an artist had been buried beneath the weight of reality. The Dream Trader's eyes glittered as he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small glass vial. Your memory, he whispered, holding it out toward her. Clara hesitated, but before she could change her mind, he uncorked the vial, and something shifted inside her. A light tug, a soft pull, and suddenly, the memory was gone. The image of her first painting, the pride she had felt, the smell of fresh paint, all of it slipped away, leaving a hollow space in her mind. The Dream Trader smiled as he placed the cork back on the vial. It's done. By morning, you will have what you desire. Clara blinked, feeling strangely lightheaded. She wanted to ask more questions, to demand how it all worked, but the words wouldn't come. She stood up from the table, dazed, and before she knew it, she was back on the sidewalk, the rain falling softly around her. The booth had vanished. The next morning, Clara's life changed. She woke to a flood of messages and emails, offers from galleries, commissions from collectors. Her artwork, which she had only casually dabbled in, was now being hailed as visionary, groundbreaking. People were desperate to buy her pieces, and her name was quickly becoming known in the art world. The success she had dreamed of for years was now hers. But something felt wrong. She couldn't shake the emptiness in her mind, the strange absence where that memory had once been. At first, it didn't bother her. After all, she had traded it willingly. But as the days went on, the emptiness grew. She found herself struggling to paint. The passion she had once felt, the connection to her work. It was fading, slipping away like a distant dream. And worse, new memories began to blur, lose their sharpness. She couldn't remember what her mother's voice sounded like when she called. She forgot the way her father used to smile at her when she was little. Slowly, piece by piece, her past was unraveling. Terrified, Clara tried to find the dream trader, to reverse the deal. But no matter where she looked, no matter how many streets she wandered at night, he was gone. Weeks passed, and Clara wasn't the only one to notice the change. People around her began acting strange, their memories faltering in ways that defied explanation. Friends would forget conversations they had just had. Strangers stared blankly, as if lost in thought, their eyes dull and distant. Some spoke of feeling like pieces of themselves had been stolen, things they couldn't quite put into words. And then there were the missing people. Rumors began to swirl about people who had made deals with the dream trader, only to disappear entirely, forgotten by everyone they had ever known. It was as if their lives had been erased, every trace of their existence wiped clean. Desperate for answers, Clara tracked down one of the few who claimed to know the truth, an old woman who had once been an opera singer, before her voice had been taken by the dream trader in exchange for a fleeting moment of fame. The woman spoke of the real price of the dream trader's deals. "He doesn't just take memories," the woman warned. "He collects them, and when he has enough, he uses them to build something terrible." Clara's stomach twisted. "What does he do with them?" The woman's eyes darkened, her voice trembling. "He feeds on them. He takes pieces of who we are, and he uses them to build worlds of his own. Twisted reflections of our reality, where those lost memories live on, but not as they were. They become shadows, echoes of what they once were, and they belong to him now." Clara's heart pounded in her chest as the woman's words sunk in. She had given up more than just a memory. She had given a piece of her soul to something far darker than she had ever imagined. And now she had to get it back, before she, too, became nothing more than an echo in the dream trader's world.